Even the biggest movie franchises have their flops. Some lost millions at the box office, others were trashed by critics, and some just didn't sit right with fans. But which ones were the worst? Today, we're breaking down the worst movies and the best franchises, based entirely on stats. We're talking box office numbers, critic scores, fan ratings, and everything in between. Get ready for some surprises, folks, because these movies might just make you rethink your favorite franchises. Let's get into it. Kicking things off, we have Marvel. The MCU has churned out some incredible films, but there's one standout flop that left fans scratching their heads: Eternals. Let's break it down. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 47%. Yep, the lowest rated MCU movie to date. Audience score: 78%. It's not the worst, but it's still pretty divisive. Box office: $402 million worldwide. Not bad, but for the MCU, it's a disappointment. Now, you might be wondering, what went wrong? Well, Eternals introduced 10 brand new characters in a single movie. That's a lot for anyone to keep up with, especially in a universe already packed with beloved heroes. Add in the slow pacing, the lack of a memorable villain, and a story that didn't seem to connect with most fans, and you've got a recipe for failure. And don't forget, some fans even questioned the film's direction. Runner-up: Thor: The Dark World. It may have made $644 million at the box office, but with a 66% critic score, it's no fan favorite. Now let's talk about DC. The DCU is notorious for its ups and downs, but the biggest disappointment, by far, has to be Justice League, 2017. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 39%. Audience score: 68%. Not horrible, but not great either. Box office: $657 million. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, after reshoot costs and behind-the-scenes drama, it barely broke even. So, what went wrong with Justice League? Well, the rushed CGI, constant studio interference, and of course, the infamous Henry Cavill mustache debacle made it a disaster. Oh, and let's not forget about the odd tone shift and lack of character development for most of the heroes. Fans were so disappointed that Warner Bros. Eventually had to release Zack Snyder's Justice League in 2021 to fix what went wrong. Runner-up: Suicide Squad, 2016, with a 26% critic score. But, hey, it made $747 million, if that counts for anything. Even Star Wars isn't immune to failure. And according to the numbers, The Rise of Skywalker is considered the biggest misstep in the entire saga. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 52%. That's the lowest of the entire franchise. Audience score: 86%. But you can bet that score was heavily debated. Box office: $1.07 billion, which seems impressive, until you compare it to The Force Awakens that made over $2 billion. The problem? A rushed storyline, the random return of Palpatine, and a general sense of confusion, especially after The Last Jedi. Fans and critics alike felt it was a hasty attempt to wrap things up without fully addressing the story's key elements. Runner-up: The Phantom Menace. It made $1 billion at the box office, but with a 51% critic score and a whole lot of Jar Jar Binks, it's hard to call it a triumph. The Wizarding World has cast a spell at the box office for years, but Fantastic Beasts: The Secrets of Dumbledore was a far cry from the magic we expected. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 46%. Audience score: 83%. Not enough to save it, though. Box office: $407 million. That's the lowest of any Harry Potter-related movie. What went wrong? For one, the plot was all over the place. Add in the recasting drama with Johnny Depp being replaced, and there was a sense of franchise fatigue. Even the die-hard fans weren't all that excited about it. Runner-up: Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, a confusing movie with a 36% critic score. Now, let's move on to Christopher Nolan's legendary Dark Knight trilogy. While most would agree it's one of the best superhero trilogies of all time, there is one film that's slightly underwhelming in comparison: The Dark Knight Rises. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 87%. Still a solid score, but the lowest of the trilogy. Audience score: 90%. But there's a divide here too. Box office: $1.08 billion. That sounds great, but when you account for inflation, it actually made less than The Dark Knight. What went wrong? The muffled voice of Bane became a meme, and the story itself had a few too many twists and turns. Plus, Batman barely fights in this one. It's still a good film, but the others in the trilogy set a very high bar. Runner-up? Honestly, there isn't one. This trilogy is rock solid, and The Dark Knight is a masterpiece. Middle-earth is one of the most beloved franchises of all time, but when it comes to the Hobbit trilogy, there's one entry that really doesn't measure up: The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 59%. Audience score: 74%. Box office: $962 million. Sure, it's profitable, but it didn't quite match up to the $1 billion plus numbers from The Lord of the Rings. So, what went wrong? Too much CGI, for starters. The Hobbit was stretched into 3 films, and by the time we got to this final chapter, it lacked the emotional depth that made The Lord of the Rings so iconic. Let's talk X-Men. This franchise has had its fair share of ups and downs, but Dark Phoenix takes the crown for the biggest flop. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 22%. Audience score: 64%. Ouch. Box office: $252 million. But here's the kicker: it lost over $133 million. Why? Rushed reshoots, a weak villain, and once again, another lackluster version of the Dark Phoenix storyline. Fans were tired of the repeated mistakes, and it showed in the numbers. Runner-up: X-Men, Apocalypse with a 47% critic score. It made $543 million, but fans didn't seem to care much. Now, let's talk about Fast and Furious. The franchise that's known for its over-the-top stunts and action, but what about the weakest entry? Fast X. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 56%. Audience score: 82%. Box office: $704 million, but it's the lowest of the recent sequels. Why did it flop? The stunts are getting even more ridiculous, the storylines are getting thinner, and the film almost feels like it's just going through the motions. Runner-up: F9, with a 59% critic score and magnets flipping cars. You know what they say, enough said. And lastly, we have Jurassic Park. The Jurassic World series brought the franchise back to life, but Jurassic World: Dominion? Not so much. Rotten Tomatoes critic score: 29%. Audience score: 77%. Box office: $1 billion, but the ticket sales dropped fast. What went wrong? The movie was more about locusts than dinosaurs, legacy characters were wasted, and the ending felt forced and unsatisfying. So there you have it, the worst movies in the biggest franchises, all based entirely on stats. But now, I want to hear from you. Which of these movies do you think was the biggest failure? Or did we miss one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you love ranking movies with hard facts, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Next time, we're breaking down the biggest box office bombs of all time. Some of these films lost more money than you can imagine. I'll see you in the next one.